My name is Clara, and this story happened when I was 26 years old. I had just moved to an old house in the country, looking for peace after years in the big city. The house was too big for me alone, but the rent was too cheap to turn down. I thought. But I soon realized that some things come with a price. The house had a peculiarity, a small room at the back. It was a strange space, with peeling walls and a small window that looked out onto the backyard. The previous owner had locked the room with a rusty padlock and advised me, laughing awkwardly, better to leave it closed. This little room has bad energy. I thought that was nonsense, but I agreed. The room was closed, and for weeks everything went well, until one rainy night I started to hear the sounds. I was watching TV in the living room when I heard a faint noise coming from the back of the house. It felt like a scratch, like nails scraping against wood. I froze for a moment, but tried to ignore it. The wind must be stirring something, I thought. Minutes later, I heard the sound of something falling to the floor, as if a heavy box had been dropped. I got up slowly and walked to the hallway that led to the back room. The light in the hallway flickered, which made me hesitate. When I reached the locked door, everything went silent. I put my ear to the wood and, for a moment, I heard something that chilled my spine. Heavy breathing on the other side. I took 2 steps back and ran to my room. I locked the door and convinced myself it was all in my head. The following night, the situation worsened. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to the sound of knocking. 3 dry, slow knocks, coming from the back room. No, no, no. I remembered the words of the previous owner and regretted not asking more about that place. I got up, grabbed a flashlight and decided to take a look, even against my instinct. Upon reaching the corridor, the silence was total. I put the flashlight on the lock and saw something strange. The scratch marks were no longer just on the door. They spread across the wall, as if something was trying to get out of the room. My heart skipped a beat when suddenly the padlock made a metallic sound. It had unlocked itself. The door creaked slowly as I opened it. The light from the flashlight illuminated the small room, and the first thing I noticed was the smell. Something old, rotten, as if time had been trapped there. On the floor were open boxes filled with old toys, porcelain dolls with missing eyes, and torn children's clothes. When I shone the light on the back wall, I saw something that shouldn't have been there, a mark of small, dirty, deep hands, as if someone had pressed hard into the plaster. Beside it, there was a word scratched on the wall. Skirt. The flashlight started to fail. I heard the room door slam behind me, and I felt an icy cold run up my spine. I turned quickly and saw a shadow moving in the corner of the room. She was short, like a child, but with arms that were too long for her body. She began to crawl towards me, making a low sound, like distorted crying. I screamed and ran, pushing the door with all my might. I locked it again with a padlock, which now seemed to be fastened firmly again, as if it had never been opened. I spent the rest of the night sitting in the living room, holding a knife and looking at the empty hallway, waiting for something to come out of there. The next morning, I called a locksmith and had the room sealed forever. Days later, I returned the house without getting the deposit back. I would rather lose money than lose my sanity. I never found out what was in that room, but to this day, when I walk by the house, I swear I still hear the low, steady knocks. My name is Gabriel, and this story happened 2 years ago, during a trip with my girlfriend, Fernanda. We decided to get away from the city for a few days to relax and find peace. We booked a small cabin that was in a forest about a 3-hour drive away from any sign of civilization. It looked perfect. The cabin's website showed a cozy place, with a fireplace, a large porch and a beautiful view of the lake. We didn't expect that the trip would turn into the worst nightmare of our lives. We arrived late in the afternoon. The road leading to the cabin was dirt and full of potholes, surrounded by tall, dense trees. There were no other houses nearby, just silence. When parking the car, we noticed that the cabin looked older and less well kept than in the photos. The woodwork was worn, and the windows had dirt marks and leaves stuck to them. I think they made the photos too pretty on the website, I joked, trying to lighten the mood. Fernanda laughed nervously, but didn't comment anything. We grabbed our things and went inside. The interior was dark and had a strong smell of damp wood. Around it, antique furniture covered in dust and an old armchair positioned in the living room, facing the fireplace. After organizing our bags, I tried to light the fireplace, but I realized that the strong wind outside was blowing through some crack, causing the fire to go out. I didn't pay much attention. We went up to the room on the second floor, which had a large window facing the forest. That was when Fernanda stopped and pointed. Someone passed by here. On the floor, there were boot prints, covered in mud, that went from the door to the center of the room and stopped there, without returning anywhere. It made me freeze inside, but I tried to act normal. It must be from the owner or someone who cleans the place. Let's just ignore it. She agreed, but the atmosphere became heavy. At night, while the storm started outside, Fernanda fell asleep. I stayed awake, playing on my cell phone, but the lack of signal forced me to put it down. The only thing that could be heard was the wind blowing against the cabin and the rain hitting the windows. Around 2 a.m., I heard a noise downstairs, a sound of something dragging on the floor. I sat on the bed, paralyzed, trying to hear better. It was as if someone was pulling a heavy piece of furniture across the wood. I looked at Fernanda, who was still sleeping soundly, and slowly went downstairs, holding my cell phone as a flashlight. When I arrived in the room, I froze. The armchair that had been facing the fireplace was now facing the stairs, as if someone had dragged it to look exactly where I was. I swallowed hard and ran back to the room. I woke Fernanda, whispering that we needed to leave immediately. She didn't understand anything at first, but when I told her what I saw, fear took over her too. As we were gathering our things, we heard the sound of footsteps coming up the stairs. Slow, heavy, one after the other. I turned off the lights in the room and closed the door, locking it. I stood there, listening to the footsteps stop right in front of the door. A deep silence followed, and then someone knocked 3 times. No, no, no. Fernanda held my hand tightly, and I could feel her body shaking. The sound stopped, but the silence outside was even more terrifying. The only sound was that of rain. We decided to leave through the window. I opened it slowly, trying not to make any noise, and helped Fernanda get down. When it was my turn, I looked down the hall for the last time. The bedroom door was ajar, and at the end of the corridor, a figure stood, completely still. Tall, thin, with something covering her face, like an old bag. She didn't move, but I could feel the eyes behind that cloth following me. We jumped to the soaked ground and ran to the car, with our cell phone flashlight lighting the way. The forest around us seemed alive, full of noises and shadows that seemed to move between the trees. When we got to the car, I quickly got in and started it. As we drove down the dirt road, I saw the cabin light in the rearview mirror, still on. A figure stood on the porch, standing in the rain, watching us. We never went back. Days later, Raphael, the owner of the cabin, called saying that there was a report of a break-in at the house after we left. The strangest thing, according to him, is that, when he got there, he found the armchair in the center of the room, facing the door, and mud marks that went all the way to the stairs, stopping in the middle of the hallway. No one ever found out who or what was there that night, but to this day, whenever I hear the sound of something being dragged across the floor, I feel the same chill running up my spine. My name is Enrique, and I live alone in a small apartment in the city center. I work as a programmer and spend most of my time at home, especially at night when deadlines are pressing. My building is old, one of those with thin walls and strange noises that we learn to ignore. But what happened a few weeks ago showed me that sometimes these noises have an explanation, and not a good one. It all started on a Wednesday. It was almost midnight, and I was finishing up reviewing some code when I heard a sound coming from downstairs. It was something like scratches, repeated, like nails scraping the floor. I stood still for a moment, trying to hear better. My neighbor in the apartment below was an elderly man who rarely left his house. I thought he was trying to drag some furniture, but the sound seemed more insistent. I took a deep breath and went back to work. Maybe it was just in my head. The following night, the sounds continued. This time there were knocks. 3 slow, loud knocks, as if someone were punching the ceiling. I looked at the floor, confused. The knocks were so loud that they made the table shake. I took my cell phone and went to the hallway, went down the stairs and stopped in front of my downstairs neighbor's door. I knocked a few times. Nothing. No sound came from there, not even the noises I had heard minutes before. I put my ear to the door, and then I heard it. It was a whisper, a low voice, almost whispered, that spoke something incomprehensible. The voice didn't sound human. It was uneven, as if it came from someone in pain. My body froze. I went back to my apartment and locked the door. I spent the rest of the night awake, with the light on, hearing the same scratching and banging echoing from downstairs. The next day, I looked for the building's superintendent. I asked if he had seen the neighbor recently. His face went pale when I mentioned the apartment. "Mr. Antonio?" he asked, looking around. He hasn't paid the rent for weeks, and no one answers when I knock on the door. "So, who's making all that noise?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. The caretaker was silent for a moment before responding. "You'd better not get involved. Leave it alone." But I couldn't leave it alone. That night, the noises got louder. The scratches now seemed to come not only from the floor, but also from the walls. The beats were so loud that I could feel the vibration in my feet. I decided I was going to solve this. I took a flashlight and went down to Mr. Antonio's apartment. When I got there, the door was ajar. A hanging chain swayed slowly, as if it had been forced. My heart was beating so hard it felt like it was going to come out of my mouth. But I went in anyway. The apartment was dark and smelled of something rotten. The ground creaked beneath my feet, and with each step the air felt heavier. I shined a light down the hallway and saw that the walls were covered in scratches. Long, deep marks, as if someone had dug their nails in there. "Mr. Antonio?" My voice was weak. The only sound was a steady drip, coming from the room at the end of the hall. I went there, and what I saw still haunts me. The room was empty except for a chair in the middle, facing the wall. On the ground, a dark puddle was slowly spreading. When I pointed the flashlight at the chair, I noticed what was there. A thin, motionless body with a head tilted forward. He couldn't see his face, but his hands were lying at his sides, with broken and bloody nails. My stomach turned. I started to back up slowly, but then I heard the front door slam. The sound echoed throughout the apartment. The flashlight shook in my hand when I heard a sound behind me. Scratches. Slowly, the head on the chair began to turn towards me, emitting a horrible dry crack. I dropped the flashlight and ran, tripping over the walls and leaving that apartment as if my life depended on it. I went up the stairs, entered my apartment and locked the door. listening to my own heart beat out of control. But it wasn't the end. That night, as I tried to calm down, I heard the scratching again. Only this time, they were coming from the ceiling. I looked up, and the sound moved slowly, as if something was crawling above me. The next morning, I called the police. They found Mr. Antonio's body in the chair, already decomposing for weeks. There were no signs of forced entry, nor of anyone else in the apartment. But the noises continued. After that day, I moved. To this day, sometimes, in the silence of the night, I still hear scratching on the walls, as if something is trying to get out. My name is Matthew, and this story happened last summer. Me and two friends, Raphael and Andre, decided to spend a weekend in an isolated cabin near a lake, a few hours from the city. The place seemed perfect. A calm lake for fishing, lots of greenery around and absolute silence. We wanted to escape the routine, without cell phone signal, without internet. Just the three of us, beer and laughs. The owner of the cabin was an acquaintance of Raphael's, and he only warned us about one thing before we went. Avoid staying at the lake at night. It's not safe. We laugh. We think he was worried about animals, or, at most, some local legend to scare tourists. Little did we know that this was a real warning. We arrived at the cabin on Friday afternoon. The place was simple but cozy. The balcony had a direct view of the lake, which looked like a mirror in the sun. We spent the day fishing and exploring the area, returning to the cabin at dusk. We had a barbecue, drank some beers, and, before dark, Raphael suggested taking a last dip in the lake. Oh, come on. Just a quick dip. What could go wrong? Even with the warning, we ended up accepting it. The water was cold, but it felt great. We swim for about 10 minutes until the sun disappears completely and the sky becomes dark. That's where it started. As we returned to shore, Andre stopped in the middle of the lake, floating on his back, looking at the starry sky. Suddenly, he shouted, "Did you hear that?" Raphael and I stopped, confused. We hadn't heard anything other than the faint waves lapping the water. "What?" I asked. "A sound, like a voice, there in the middle of the lake." We thought he was joking, but seconds later, we heard it. A distant sound, almost like a whisper, echoing across the surface of the water. It was impossible to tell what he was saying, but he sounded human. We quickly returned to the cabin, laughing nervously and trying to convince ourselves that it was all in our heads. The wind, perhaps. We closed the door and windows, lit a fire in the fireplace, and played a few games of cards to forget what had happened. Around midnight, Raphael looked out the window and turned pale. "There's someone out there." We ran to the window. Outside, near the lake shore, was a figure. It was difficult to see clearly in the darkness, but it looked like someone standing motionless, looking toward the cabin. "It must be another tourist, right?" Andre said, trying to remain calm. "At midnight, no flashlight, without moving," I whispered. We watched in silence for a few minutes. The figure did not move. It did not emit a sound. It was just there, like a shadow highlighted by the dim moonlight. Then, without warning, she entered the water. We saw her slowly walk into the lake until the water completely covered her. Nobody could sleep that night. We locked all the doors and stayed together in the living room, trying to ignore the sound of the wind and the rustling leaves. Around 3 a.m. we heard a wet noise on the porch deck. Heavy footsteps, as if someone was walking with wet feet. The footsteps stopped right in front of the main door. I held my breath as we heard a slow, dragging sound, light taps on the wood of the door. "No, no, no," None of us had the courage to move. Silence returned, but we knew something was out there, still waiting. At dawn, we decided to leave. We left without looking at the lake, without looking back. As we were loading our bags into the car, Raphael stopped and pointed to the deck. There were wet footprints, huge and disproportionate, as if something had walked to the door and gone back into the water. On the way home, Raphael's acquaintance called us to find out how the trip had been. We nervously told him what had happened. He was silent for a moment before saying, "I told you so. People who go into the lake at night, sometimes they don't come back alone." We never went back to that cabin. And to this day, when I see a lake at dusk, I swear I hear that same distant whisper echoing across the water. My name is Lucas, and I have lived in the United States for just over 5 years. I came here to work as a computer technician, and I live in a simple rented house in a quiet, middle-class neighborhood. Everything in the neighborhood has always been calm and routine. Children riding their bikes, dogs barking, and people gardening. It's the kind of place where nothing strange should happen. Until that week. It all started on Monday. When I left for work in the morning, I noticed that the house next door, which had been empty for months, now had a car parked in the garage. It was a black sedan, without a license plate. I thought it was strange, but I imagined they were new tenants arriving. That same night, when I returned, the house next door was completely dark, even with the car still in the garage. There was no sign of movement, no lights on. I was curious, but I didn't pay much attention. Maybe they were still organizing things. On Wednesday night, things started to get really weird. I was in the kitchen, preparing something to eat, when I heard a sound coming from the backyard. It was as if someone was walking slowly, stepping on the dry leaves near the fence. I went to the window and looked out, but I didn't see anything. The yard was empty, lit only by the streetlight on the sidewalk. I let it go. Maybe it was a raccoon or some other common animal around here. However, in the early hours of the morning, I woke up to a more disturbing noise, light knocks on my bedroom wall. There were no plumbing noises, nor wind noises. There were rhythmic knocks, coming from the side where the empty house was. No, no, no. I was frozen for a few seconds, trying to understand. My room is on the second floor, and there was no way anyone could get there without a ladder. I got up slowly and went to the window. When I opened the curtain, what I saw left me cold. The light from the streetlight was faintly illuminating the house next door, and in the second-story window, someone was standing watching me. The figure didn't move, just looked at me. She was tall, thin, and appeared to be wearing dark clothes. I couldn't make out the face. I blinked, and the figure disappeared, as if it had never been there. On Thursday, when I got home from work, I decided to check out the house next door. I needed some explanation. I walked to the front door and knocked. No response. I looked out the living room window and saw the empty interior. The black car was still in the garage, covered in dust, as if no one had used it for a long time. As I walked home, I felt like someone was watching me. When I looked back, I was sure. A shadow passed by the second-story window, too quickly for it to be my imagination. That night, I couldn't sleep. Around 2 a.m., I heard the knocking on the wall again. This time, they were stronger and faster, as if something was trying to provoke me. My heart raced, and at the same moment, the sound stopped. Suddenly, the silence was broken by the sound of the doorbell. I was frozen. Who would ring the doorbell at that hour? I took my cell phone and went to the door. I looked through the peephole, but I didn't see anyone. Just the deserted street, lit by the streetlight. The doorbell rang again. I opened the door just a crack and looked outside. There was still no one there, but when I looked down, I saw something that made me freeze. A piece of paper folded on the carpet. I took the paper and opened it. On it was written, in shaky, blurred letters, "Don't look up." I felt a shiver go up my spine. Instinctively, I looked up at the top floor of the house next door. In the second floor window, the same figure was there, watching me. This time I could see better. The face was pale, the eyes were sunken, and there was something wrong with the smile. Too wide, distorted, as if it weren't human. I closed the door tightly and locked myself in the room, calling the police. When police arrived, they searched the house next door but found nothing. No car, no figure. The house was completely empty, as if no one had lived there for a long time. A week later, the owner of the property told me something that made me regret asking. The house? No one stays there for long. The last resident said he heard knocking on the wall and saw someone on the second floor. After that, I moved house. No matter where I go, I still have the feeling that I'm being watched. And sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I hear a faint sound coming from the wall. Knock. No. No. My name is Pedro, and I have always liked hiking. Living in the big city makes me anxious, so I usually escape on the weekends for secluded trails and long walks in nature. I always say that, in the solitude of the forest, you find peace. But that time, I found something I would have preferred never to see. It was a Saturday in the fall, and I chose a trail in a forest preserve that was a few hours' drive away. It wasn't visited much, which was perfect for me. I arrived early and started my hike with a light backpack, water, snacks, and a coat in case it got cold. The sky was clear when I started, and the sound of birds mixed with the wind in the trees made me relax. The trail was simple, well marked, and I intended to cover it in its entirety in 4 or 5 hours. But as the afternoon progressed, I noticed that the forest was getting darker, and a fine mist began to spread between the trees. Strange, there was no fog forecast today. I muttered to myself. I kept walking, but from that moment on, I started to feel restless. It was as if something was watching me. A few minutes later, I stopped to drink water and realized that I could no longer hear the sounds of the forest. No birds, no rustling leaves, nothing. The silence was absolute, and the fog had become thicker, making it difficult to see in the distance. I looked back the way I was coming and noticed that the trail seemed to have gotten narrower, as if the trees had gotten closer. I took a deep breath and continued. I didn't want to waste time, after all. The sun was already starting to disappear over the horizon. After walking a few more meters, I noticed something strange on the ground. There were footprints. They were human footprints, but they were facing backwards. My heart started to beat faster. Logic told me that someone could have walked there and come back the same way, but that didn't seem natural. The marks continued in a straight line, sunk in the mud, until they disappeared further ahead, in the fog. It must be all in my head. I tried to convince myself. The feeling of being watched only got worse. With every step, I was sure that someone or something was following me. I looked back several times, but there was no one. Still, I heard the sound. Steps. Slow and rhythmic, stepping on the dry leaves. When I stopped, the sound stopped too. When he started walking again, the steps returned, closer than before. I decided to speed up the pace. The problem was that the more I walked, the more lost I seemed to be. The trail that was once clear was now covered in fog and the shadows that grew with dusk. It was then that I saw, in the middle of the trees, something that made me freeze. A figure. At first it looked like a thin trunk, but as I focused more, I saw that it was a silhouette of someone standing in the trees. The figure was tall and thin, motionless, as if watching me. His face was covered in shadow, but I could swear there was something wrong with the shape of his head, too elongated, almost disproportionate. My mind was screaming at me to run, but my legs felt stuck to the ground. I blinked, and when I opened my eyes, the figure was no longer there. That's when I heard a voice, low, dragging, coming from all directions at once. It shouldn't be here. My body finally reacted. I ran as fast as I could along the trail, even though I couldn't see straight. Branches hit my face. My boots slipped on the muddy ground, but I didn't stop. The footsteps behind me got faster, following mine. After what seemed like an eternity, the fog began to clear, and I saw the trailhead. The last light of the day illuminated my parked car, and I ran to it without looking back. Inside the car, I locked the doors, trying to catch my breath. I looked in the rearview mirror, and the forest looked normal again. But when I started the car, I felt a shiver run down my spine. On the fogged glass of the back seat, there were marks, small and elongated, like fingers scratching the glass. I got out of there as quickly as I could, and never went back to that reservation. Since that day, I have avoided lonely trails, because there are places that nature keeps for itself, and where, perhaps, we should never enter. My name is Julia, and I studied at an old school in the countryside. It was a huge place, built decades ago, with long corridors and rooms that always seemed dark, even during the day. Teachers and students often commented on strange things that happened in the building, but, of course, no one took them seriously. Until the day we discovered what was in room 13. Room 13 was a deactivated classroom at the end of the hallway on the 3rd floor, where no one went. The windows were boarded up, and the door was always locked. The story the students told was that, years ago, a student had disappeared there during a class, and after that the room was closed. It seemed like just a school urban legend, until the day my friends and I decided to explore the place. It was a Friday afternoon, and the school was almost empty. Me, Carol, Bruno and Mateusz agreed to meet after class to try to get into room 13. Mateusz had gotten the master key hidden in the janitor's room. The idea seemed fun, something to laugh about later, but deep down we all felt butterflies in our stomachs. We went up the stairs to the 3rd floor. The hallway was deserted, and the dim lights made the shadows seem even longer. The door to room 13 was different from the others. Old, worn, with peeling paint and an almost erased number 13 in the center. "Ready?" Mateusz whispered, holding the key. Nobody responded. We just nodded. He turned the key, and the lock made a low, dry sound. The door opened slowly, creaking, as if it hadn't been touched in years. The room was dark, with old desks stacked in a corner, covered in dust. The smell was of old wood and mold, and the silence was so profound that it seemed as if the entire world had stopped outside. "That's no big deal," Bruno said, trying to sound confident. Carol pointed to the blackboard. There were chalk marks, as if someone had written something but then forcefully erased it. I got closer and noticed that, even though they were erased, some words were still visible. "Help me. Did you see that?" I asked, my voice low. Before anyone could respond, we heard a sound coming from the hallway. Footsteps. They were slow, steady, and approaching the room door. "Someone is coming," Carol whispered, with wide eyes. Mateusz ran to the door to lock it, but the moment he put his hand on the handle, the door closed with a bang on its own. We were paralyzed. "That wasn't the wind," I whispered, looking around. Suddenly, the stacked desks began to creak, as if something was moving in the dark corner of the room. Bruno took out his cell phone and turned on the flashlight. The beam of light illuminated part of the room, but the corner still seemed darker than it should have been. That's when we saw it. In the corner, between the desks, there was a crouched figure. It was small, as if it were a child, but the outlines were blurred, difficult to see. The figure moved, and a low sound, like distorted crying, filled the room. "Who's there?" Matthäus asked, his voice shaking. The figure began to slowly crawl towards us, and Bruno's cell phone flashlight failed. We were left in the dark, with only the sound of dragging on the floor and that muffled cry filling the room. "Let's get out of here," I shouted. Matthäus tried to open the door again, but it wouldn't budge. Carol started knocking on the door, screaming for help, but the sound didn't seem to leave the room. It was as if we were isolated from the rest of the world. That's when everything stopped. Silence returned, and the door opened on its own, creaking slowly. We ran outside without looking back, running down the stairs as fast as we could. When we reached the courtyard, we were all pale and out of breath. "What was that?" Carol whispered, looking at the dark building on the 3rd floor. On Monday, Matthäus tried to return the master key to the janitor's room, but the janitor looked at him strangely. "What key is that? We took the lock off room 13 years ago. There is no longer any key there." Since that day, none of us have been back to the 3rd floor. Room 13 remains closed, but sometimes students say they hear knocking on the door and soft crying coming from the empty hallway.